This is one of the greatest evenings, one of the best opportunities for me to really turn on my thinking cap, because I have sitting next to me the one, the only Robert Mills, coming to you not high atop the mountain sitting behind him, but somewhere in front of that. It's actually a mountain that he has actually climbed. But we're going to explore a topic today that is, I call it a thinking man's game. This is going to be one where we hope that you sit down and have the opportunity to think through one of the most interesting topics ongoing today that I guess we'll give you the conclusion to. We don't know what the conclusion is. So anyway, with that being the start, the preamble to the conclusion, Robert Mills, how are you doing this evening, sir?
Terrific, Randy, and thank you for that introduction. And it's always a delight to be with you. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Well, we look forward to these opportunities to share your incredible power of thinking. Now, just to reflect, Robert's history in many different, I can't even, if we wanted to do a half-hour show, which we've done, you can go back and watch him, but he's been all over the world. He was an attorney for an advocate for a lot of class action suits for the consumers. He worked with a lot of significant attorneys with him to do some great things in the past years. But from that, he grew into, in his life today, doing in the city of San Francisco. He leads tours. I guess we would call them historical tours, but he is a profound, great pilot, still climbs all kinds of mountains that sit through California, and I'm not sure where else around the world. He just told me that he has a tent that has actually a wood burning stove now, and who wouldn't want that convenience when you're 85,000 feet above the planet, trying on your own. So he's just a great guy, and I look forward to today to his sharing his thoughts on this particular topic. And with that all being said, Robert, I'm leaving that topic to you. How would you like to introduce that? So welcome, and let's get it going.
Thank you, Randy. We have a fascinating podcast for you today. We're going to explore what being pro-life actually means. And it's not what you think, okay? As you know, those who oppose abortion in the United States have appropriated the phrase pro-life to describe their position on this very fraught issue. And I think it's very clever on their part. It's potent and it's a compelling slogan. And I think it's very clever and has a lot of positive and affirming connotations. And it even has the added virtue of containing the implication that those who do not share the anti-abortion views of the advocates are in some way anti-life. Doesn't say that, but it's implied there. So let me say right now that we are not in this podcast, not going to talk about abortion. It's not about abortion, okay? The abortion question revolves around the question of whether a fetus is a human being and is thus entitled to the protections of a human being, or alternatively is it a piece of flesh that's under the jurisdiction of its mother. And from a political or governmental perspective, that whole issue addresses whether the question should be left to the mother and her doctor, or whether abortion is murder and has to be banned by the state. We're not going to get into that discussion here because the question is unresolvable. It seeks to settle what philosophers call a metaphysical issue, which is beyond the reach of scientific evidence or logic. Thus, any debate about the pros and cons of abortion is inherently sterile and barren, and as a result, it's unproductive. So we're going to get to the fun stuff in a minute here, okay? But bear with me while I just touch base with what I mean by barren and sterile discussion about abortion, and it is that I just want to distinguish here at the outset, the distinction between a debate between our discussion between the proponents and the opponents of abortion, okay, about how they might work together in a common community to resolve this, okay, both sides are in this same community, and if they could figure out a way to tolerate each other and live together, that would be, and not to be each other's throats, that would be useful and needed. But it's an entirely different type of discussion than a debate over the merits of who's right. In other words, to use an analogy, if you took Jews, Christians, Muslims, and atheists and put them down into a room together and said, look, we all live in this little community, and we're going to have a discussion about how we can get along together and find a way to work together, that would be a very productive and useful discussion, okay? But it would be a very different one than a discussion about whether Christianity is the true religion and the others are wrong, or vice versa. Okay, that discussion, that latter discussion, is going nowhere. Okay, and the discussion about whether abortion is murder or a fundamental right is going nowhere either. And so we're not going to go there here. Okay, let's get back to the fun stuff here. As you all know, there are a multitude of governmental actions and policies and laws that have a direct and profound and immediate impact on human mortality, and in the jurisdictions where those laws are enacted. Okay, let's take a quick peek at a few representative examples of such actions, so you know what I'm talking about here. Okay, the government's providing adequate prenatal medical care to poor and vulnerable groups can have a big impact on infant mortality. If you take that poor teenager that's pregnant, who's got no money, no health insurance, and force her to carry that pregnancy to term without health insurance, okay, and without maternal health care, without ever seeing a doctor, and with, excuse me, I forgot to turn it off. And without health care, without ever seeing a doctor, without access to medical resources, especially if there's complications in the pregnancy, then that situation is going to inherently cause a big increase in that unborn child's risk of premature mortality, and even the pregnant girl's chance of dying from complications of pregnancy, okay? Likewise, there's a host of other modest, reasonable gun regulations, okay, not that violate the Second Amendment, but just modest things that have been shown through hard evidence will have a profound effect in reducing gun violence and the resulting deaths. California cut its gun mortality in half by enacting a few reasonable gun regulations. And likewise, if you lower speed limits on highways in certain areas and lower blood alcohol limits for drunk driving, those measures have been proved to sharply reduce auto accidents, okay? And these are just a few of the many rules, regulation, laws, and government policies that impact mortality and can thus save lives and reduce avoidable deaths, or alternatively, in the failure to enact such laws, they can cause lives to be lost that would otherwise be saved. The obvious argument here, and I'm sure you saw it coming, is that if you're not just someone who claims to be pro-life, but you're someone who's actually pro-life, then it follows that you're morally and logically obligated to support all reasonable and financially feasible government action, laws, and policies that reduce mortality and improve public health, especially for the poor and the vulnerable, okay? And if you're pro-life, you're equally obligated, to oppose all those government policies and actions that increase premature deaths. Otherwise, it makes no sense to say that you're pro-life. What could it possibly mean if it doesn't mean at least that? And
well, let's go back on what you just said, because I think that is the crux of what we're going to be talking about today, is that if you believe in one, then what would follow logically? You would believe in the next 4 or 5, correct?
If you're pro-life, then it means it logically follows that you're obligated and morally and logically obligated to support a series of policies that result in lower mortality and save lives. Just the same as if the people who oppose abortion say that abortion, by doing that, they save lives, that the reduced abortion saves lives. Well, if these government actions save lives, you're equally obligated to do that, right? That's just logic.
Right. I just wanted to tie that together because that disconnect today, that, it's like, where's the water? Because all I can see is the ocean. You've painted the picture that's so obvious from the beginning, and I just wanted to lay that foundation as we go on, because sometimes people pull the curtain back on the closet just to see the Sunday go to meeting clothes, but not their dig it in the dirt clothes. So continue, Robert. I don't know.
That is a very, very good point, Randy. That a lot of people preach things in that they don't actually practice. If you look at what they actually do, okay, and you probably saw this coming, my dear listeners, but you'll learn in this podcast why, as Randy just mentioned, that a lot of people who say they're pro-life are not really pro-life at all. They're pro-fetus maybe, but they're not pro-life. And some people argue that really means they just want to control women, but I'll leave that to you. So what does all this mean? Okay, what does it really mean to be pro-life, and what does it require of people who are pro-life? So I'm going to jump in here, what I'm saying here is that, and I'm going to qualify this in a bit because I'm going to use a lot of government statistics and stuff, but I want to start this discussion about the impact of state laws and policies on public mortality. We just talked about this. I want to do it specifically, okay? So that's what pro-life is supposed to be about. Let's start with this very big picture, okay? And I'm going to do this by comparing two states, okay? The impact of a bunch of laws and regulations in two U.S. states, Massachusetts and Mississippi, okay? And in doing this, I want to recognize that this can be a little misleading, and these kind of comparisons tend to oversimplify, and I'm comparing essentially an urban educated state with a rural uneducated state that's poor. And so it's not going to be an apples to apples. I'm not going to make that argument, but in the big picture, I think it's accurate enough to prove the point we're trying to make here, okay? So why did I pick these states? Well, obviously because Massachusetts provides its citizens one of the most comprehensive regulations providing prenatal health care. And as a result of that, Massachusetts has the lowest infant mortality rate in the US. It also has a number of gun control restrictions that have contributed to its having one of the lowest rates of gun violence, and one of the better states in terms of offering health care to the elderly and the poor, and providing other safety regulations like enforcing drunk driving laws, which they do strictly in Massachusetts, and all of which protect its citizens, okay? In other words, Massachusetts is proactive in enacting laws and policies that are pro-life. In contrast, Mississippi offers very limited prenatal care, and as a result, it has the highest infant mortality rate in the US. Mississippi has almost no gun regulation. As a result, it has the highest rate of gun-related deaths in the US. Its overall health care offers very limited care to its poor and to its elderly, okay? So let's compare then the health outcomes in the aggregate of these two states. No surprise coming here, I promise you. Let's start with the big picture. In 2023, Mississippi had an overall death rate of all causes of 1,064 persons per 100,000 people, okay? For a total death count of 31,282 people statewide that year. Massachusetts, in contrast, had an overall death rate that same year of only 699 persons per 100,000. Thus, if Mississippi employed the same medical care, health, gun safety laws, and other health and safety regulations and protections as Massachusetts, it presumably would have enjoyed the same overall mortality rate. Now, qualified by those things I just mentioned, okay? And as a result, assuming an apples to apples straight across, they would have had only 20,543 deaths in Mississippi. And thus, Mississippi if it had adopted Massachusetts health, safety, medical services, and other health and safety protections, and assuming, and again, it's a big assumption that this would apply apples to apples, it would then have saved the lives of 10,739 persons that year in Mississippi alone. Now, that number of presumed lives in 1 year, 10,739, is particularly salient to this discussion here of who and what policies are pro-life, because it is 4.21 times the total number of annual abortions in Mississippi in 2020, which was the last full year when abortions were still performed in Mississippi. Okay, as a result, if you claim to be pro-life, would it not logically follow that to be truly pro-life, you'd be compelled to support Mississippi enacting that same package of health safety laws as Massachusetts, as that would have saved thousands and thousands of lives in Mississippi that year alone? Now, whether it's 10,000 or not, or 4.21 times the number of lives saved, quote, unsaved by abortions that weren't performed anymore, is not certain, but it would certainly have saved thousands of lives in Mississippi, okay? Now, the pro-life opponents of abortion often refer to abortions banned or prevented as lives saved, okay, which raises the question of how those who supported banning abortions in Mississippi fared on this issue, okay? There were 2,550 abortions performed in Mississippi in 2021, the last year, the last full year in which they were performed. And they blocked it on the grounds that that's pro-life because it saved 2,550 unborn lives. But yet those same people refused to support health and safety regulations that would have saved lives, using the Massachusetts comparison, of over 4 times as many of already living persons, the 4 times the number of already living persons' lives. So could it be that those who turn their backs on that many living persons and ignore their premature deaths are not really pro-life at all? They're pro-fetus, or they're pro-controlling women, or they're hypocrites. Or I leave that to you, dear listeners and viewers, to make that up for yourself, okay? The key question for us here and for you is whether, what does it signify? What does it signify when citizens say that they're pro-life and vote to ban abortions or to, quote, save lives, but refuse to fund healthcare or enact laws that would save many times more existing lives? Are they just unaware of the profound illogic and contradictions of these inconsistent positions? What is a hypocrite? I leave it to you. As an interesting tidbit and aside here, though, before we go on, it updates the addressed issue of, quote, saved lives. There were no legal abortions performed in medical offices in 2024 because the state had outlawed abortions after the Dobbs case. Yet that did not stop Mississippians from seeking and securing abortions. No, it didn't. What did they do? They went out of state. The total number of Mississippi residents who had abortions in 2024 actually went up. It rose, okay, than those performed before abortions were banned. And they were essentially all performed out of state, okay? Nationwide, the number of reported legal abortions continued to increase after the Dobbs case overturned Roe versus Wade, and after which half of all the states in the U.S. outright banned or deeply restricted abortions. And according to a report by the University of California, San Francisco, there were 82,000 legal abortions a month in the United States in 2022 before the Dobbs case. But that number had increased to a total of 86,000, that's 4,000 a month more, in 2023 after Dobbs. The increase in the number of abortions nationwide continues to increase. It continues to increase every month. Okay. Now, why? One possible explanation is that the extremely high profile discussion about abortions in the aftermath of the Dobbs case has informed and educated a number of poor and otherwise uninformed women about the option to have an abortion, and who to contact and how to go about it, about which they were previously unaware. And now they're exercising this newly discovered option. Okay, that could explain why it keeps going up. So now, before we go on, let's use this same lens, the same apples to apples comparison between vital statistics of Massachusetts and Mexico regarding infant mortality, because that's kind of directly on point here, and have a quick peek at these two states' health and maternal care laws and how that affected their respective infant and mortality, maternal mortality. Okay, Mississippi had 34,000 lives, 34,675 live births in 2021, infant mortality of 9.11 per thousand. Okay,
Robert, could you go back and just restate that again? That figure that you just stated.
Mississippi had 34,675 live births in 2021. Okay, with an infant mortality rate among those live births of 9.11 per thousand live births. Okay, for a total of 316 infant deaths that year. Now, that number, 9.11 per thousand, compare that to Massachusetts, 3 point something, and San Francisco has an infant mortality of just over 1. So, people say that we don't have family values. Now, you subtract from the infant mortality rate the number of infants who die, which is what infant mortality is, the number of infants who die between the time of conception and the end of the first birthday. That's what infant mortality is. Okay, and on the averages, there's about 1 in 1,000 of the mothers who die, well, from complications. Okay, but 1 out of every 1,000 children that are born worldwide have some sort of birth defect. I mean, they're missing kidneys or lungs or brains or whatever that are incompatible with life. So 1 out of 1,000 infants cannot be saved. They die of natural causes, and nothing that the government can do or anybody could save them. Okay, so they don't count in these statistics. They're just taken out at the top. Okay, so we take that out, we have a gross infant mortality in Mississippi of 8.11 per thousand. Okay, which means roughly 281 infants born in Mississippi in 2021. Their lives could have been saved if their mothers had access to the adequate medical care. Okay, add to that the maternal deaths. There were 48 of them that they actually measured, and take out the ones that probably would have died anyway, and you have about 35 maternal deaths. So in 2021, Mississippi had a total of 316 theoretically savable mothers and infants who died because Mississippi chose not to provide them with adequate care. And they would all be alive today and with us today if Mississippi had provided them with this essential care. Now, I know some people make the arguments that maybe Mississippi could not afford that, and so I'm not going to address that here. I think that that's a decision that Mississippi could have made to afford. It's not that expensive, okay? But at least I want people to know that's a counter argument. They couldn't afford to do that. So during this time, Mississippi had 760,000 kids between the age of 1 and 19 who experienced a mortality rate of 85 per 100,000, or 365 kids that died premature from firearms, overdoses, inadequate medical treatment, all kinds of stuff. And it's hard to say how many could have been saved if the prevention measures were taken. So as a proxy, again, because I think this is really helpful to compare states, let's just use Massachusetts, okay? And use this mortality rate of 14.7 per thousand, or 112 in Mississippi, on the assumption that if Mississippi did what Massachusetts did, it would presumably have the same outcome, okay? And it might not. We talked about that. They might be poor community. It might not be exactly the same outcome. But if they did what Massachusetts did, it would be approximately the same. So let's subtract the 112, the proportional number of kids who would have died anyway, even if Mississippi had adopted Massachusetts's care. And we have a total of 353 kids in Mississippi whose lives would have been saved and would be alive today if Mississippi had adopted the same maternal care as Massachusetts. Multiply this times 17 years, from the ages of 1 to 17. And we have a total of 4,301 kid deaths that presumably would have been avoided if they were given medical care and remedial and other safety measures were taken during their childhood, the same as took place in Massachusetts. If we add this up for the 17 years, then we come up with 5,532 lives saved. And if we add that to the infant mortality rate, we get 9,833 lives of a generation of children, kids, and mothers who would be alive today if Mississippi had adopted Massachusetts health and safety and maternal health care rules. Okay. Again, the argument can be made they didn't have the money for that, but I think that they did. And I think that they could have done a lot of this and they could have made a difference, but they did not. Okay?
Yeah, just to clarify, just to go back and say it in old Uncle Randy's terms, is that basically if the state of Mississippi could have educated, got the word out, and enacted the laws the Massachusetts had in place that would have provided the health care, the education, that the state of Massachusetts had enacted, that staggering total of 9,833 kids would be alive today just simply by enacting the same, empirical things that Massachusetts did, setting aside, the difference in education and everything else like that. I mean, and again, the point that Robert's trying to make is that if you are somebody that believes in somebody has the absolute best right to life, then these particular changes, the way I would say it is, you should be as passionate to have those changed as much as anybody, any of these laws. You would be there not only, you would take a look at those deaths and say, hey, Massachusetts did it. I care as much about these other things that could change to save our lives in Mississippi, but it just doesn't seem to happen that way, Robert. And
you nailed that, Randy. You got that exactly right. And so what I'm doing there is, Mississippi has this death rate with and I'm saying that, okay, we couldn't save all of them. I mean, nobody would argue that they were all savable or any kind of that's unrealistic. Okay, but so I'm saying let's just be practical and let's take as a hypothetical and compare Mississippi's rules and regulations and the outcome with the outcome in Massachusetts, per capita in Massachusetts. So now we do apples to apples here, and it's not really apples because it's kind of a urban state with a rural state, but it's a close, facsimile of it. And we take Massachusetts rules and bring them over to Mississippi and enact them. Things would be better. How much better? Well, if it was the same as Massachusetts, there'd be 9,833 people alive, that would be dead under the Mississippi rules. So this is just one way of roughly and comparably comparing two states and the outcomes in two states. And I think we can concede that it's not perfect and it's not one-to-one, but still it makes the point. And the point being that Massachusetts rules and regulation would have saved a heck of a lot of people, thousands of them, no doubt, that died in Mississippi for want of these things, which I submit are affordable and would have been there for people, could have been there if Mississippians had elected to do it. If they took it seriously, said, we are pro-life, we are going to take care of these living people and not let something bad happen to them. And we're going to enact these rules, or some of them, they could have saved lives. They chose not to do so. While still claiming to be pro-life.
Yeah, I'm going to put it in a very blunt way, I guess. Let's say that Massachusetts found complete cure for pancreatic cancer. Just theoretically, in Massachusetts, they find a way. Their labs come up with, in this experimental lab that I'm creating in my mind, that they find a way to cure pancreatic cancer. Well, the people living in the state of Mississippi or any other state would take a look at that state of Massachusetts and say, holy cow. You go there, they got that pancreatic cancer stuff, we might have a good chance. But whatever state is not Massachusetts, and their laws say, well, that's just too experimental. We don't believe in that. hadn't been around long enough, and it's just too good to be true. No, we can't do it. And by the way, it'll be illegal for you to travel to Massachusetts to get that. Okay. So if you have pancreatic cancer, bye-bye, have a nice trip, and thank you for flying the state airline, because you're gonna die. And those people up there, yeah, they're crazy. I know that they got the solution to it, but we're just gonna let it go right now. Now,
Well,
I'm just saying that it's just how, I mean, in the weirdest sense of how I put that. And of course, we have a friend that is right now dying of pancreatic cancer, which is awful. I'd love to have that magic wand to wave over him, but it's no different. It's if you're looking at across the state line and you see something better, and you could sit and say, hey, my kids have a better chance of getting through teenage years and growing up and being healthy, you would think the people in other states would be screaming.
well, that's really right on point again, Randy. And the health, there are, you can argue with the health and safety regulations and maternal care and providing care to the elderly and providing money to them. That's expensive, and people argue that we can't afford it, that they can't afford it, but we can make that argument. But let's shift over here to some arenas where that argument doesn't apply at all. Okay, and that's the first one to talk about is guns. Okay, guns regulations don't cost anything, and they're available for everybody. And so the only reason that people don't enact these gun regulations is because of some stubborn, we want to worship guns or Second Amendment stuff. And the Second Amendment doesn't say what people say it says. But even so, these regulations I'm going to talk about here are in no way incompatible with the Second Amendment. They respect the Second Amendment, and they don't restrict access, don't unreasonably restrict access, but there are little things that can be done free that make a big difference. Okay. And guns are a splendid example of this pro-life discussion. Okay. Because it's hard to imagine a clearer and more dramatic example of public laws and policies that more directly affect the public, life and death. If 30,000 Americans die every year from guns, the leading cause of death in the United States for children 1 to 17 years old is being shot. That's their leading cause of death. Okay. This is vastly more than any other of our peer countries. The United States firearm homicide rate is 33 times greater than Australia, 77 times greater than Germany. And it's 450 times higher than England and South Korea, 450 times higher. Okay. So now we come to these pro-life options that are available. Okay. And to give you an example, California had a very high gun death rate, and it started enacting some of these simple measures that are consistent with the Second Amendment and actually pretty popular. And California reduced its gun homicide rate in half, and it's now the most has the highest gun safety rate of any state. It worked. Okay. We have a death rate is 43% lower than the national average. In comparison, Texas and Florida are way higher. They're 1.5 times higher mortality rates, and they're surging up. And since the early 1900s, when we cut our death rate in half, California has saved the lives of 100. If the U.S. adopted the same thing as California, okay, there would be 140,000 lives saved between 2013 and 2022. If people just adopted the same rules as California, other states did, okay? And they're pretty relatively straightforward here. And I'm talking about banning guns, okay? I'm not talking about something that's going to get the Second Amendment people up in, no, because banning guns is not politically feasible. And we can eliminate gun violence and went around to every house and confiscate. That's never going to happen, okay? So keeping this in the realm of the possible and the feasible, okay? There are 6 categories of gun regulations that have been found to work and are popular and reduce gun homicides and are therefore, if you're pro-life, you would support them, okay? One is get rid of assault rifles. Assault rifles are responsible for a lot of deaths. I mean, they're pretty much not used for hunting. or self-defense, they're largely used in homicides. And they make the homicides a lot worse, as we can see from these kids. These school shootings are always an assault rifle, and if it was a pistol or something, they would kill less people. Now, the first thing you can do in gun safety is background checks. Okay, before you give somebody a gun or allow them to buy a gun, you do a background check. If they're a convicted felon, if they have restraining orders against them, against their spouse for threatened violence, if they have certain drug convictions and hate crimes, if they're under conservatorship or they have mental competency issues, if they've been convicted in the past of killing animals, pets, there's a huge correlation between people that kill pets and people that go on and kill people. And so if you ban people from who killed animals from getting guns, you'd save a lot of lives. And you require people to take gun safety courses, okay? Eliminate the stand your ground law. Some of these states have passed this, which the gun peoples point out, a shoot first, ask questions later laws. They don't protect people. They create a lot of trouble with people shooting people that didn't have to be shot. It require a permit for people carrying concealed weapons. And then one of the things that's really effective is what they call extreme risk laws or red flag laws. If people are threatening public officials, if they have restraining orders against their wives or girlfriends, and they, you don't give them guns, okay? If they have mental illness or they have competency and so forth, you don't give them guns. So and then there's of course the secure storage requirements that can be enacted. People put their loaded pistol in the drawer next to their bed, okay? And their 8-year-old son or 4-year-old kid goes in there, opens the drawer, takes out the pistol, goes into the living room where his friends are and shoots one of them. Happens all the time. Kids shoot other kids and get shot because people leave loaded guns laying. And so secure storage requirements would save quite a large number of children, okay? And then, of course, you could easily set up systems to track ghost guns that are popping up with gangs and stuff and everything. That would be so those simple, easy to enact protections, which are not that objectionable, don't impinge on the First Amendment, and they protect the rights of the law-abiding gun owners. They've been shown to save thousands and thousands of lives, okay? So if you're pro-life, then you're morally obligated and legally obligated, I suggest, to support the passage of these sorts of effective and easy to enforce and inexpensive gun regulations, okay? And sadly, these measures are strongly opposed by the same people who call themselves pro-life. And so let's take another set of restrictions that are extremely effective in saving lives, and that is the drunk driving laws, okay? Drunk driving is illegal in every state, and yet the United States, someone dies from drunk driving collision every 52 minutes. 1 out of every 4 highway deaths is caused by a drunk driver. The tragic loss of life is difficult to quantify. That there's estimates that it costs us $100 billion a year. And there's this group called Motorists Against Drunk Driving, an advocacy group, and they have been campaigning against drunk driving since 1980, and they have driven down the drunk driving deaths from their enactments by 50%. They've been enormously successful, but they want to go on and drive it down to zero or close to zero, okay? And so they have a number of ways that they suggest that can be done, and it's shown to be done, and not all that inexpensive and not that objectionable, okay? And so these are options that people who are pro-life can lobby for in their own state legislatures to help achieve the goal of zero highway deaths from drunk driving, okay? One, highly visible enforcement. When people see people being arrested for drunk driving or see people being stopped, it slows people down. It makes them more cautious. Sobriety checkpoints scare the heck out of people that are drinking. It is shown to be quite effective. If people think there's sobriety checkpoints, they hold off on that drinking. And there's implied consent laws. If you put it in the law that if you get a driver's license and you get behind the wheel, you have implied that you give your consent if you're stopped to require, going through a breathalyzer test, okay? And there's ignition interlock devices that states can impose on a drunk driver. Okay, if you're convicted of a drunk driving offense. They can require you to put that on your steering wheel, and then you have to blow into something to start the engine. And if you're drunk, you can't drive, okay? And the technology now exists to require ignition interlocks to be built into all cars. In fact, some of them can work on a finger. You can put your finger and it will tell it what the alcohol is, or you can blow into something and it will then lock you out of the car if you're not fit to drive. Now, 45% of the impaired drivers have also tested positive for other controlled substances. So that's something that can be worked on. And if we lower the drug alcohol levels that qualifies drunk driving, that is proved to be effective. Utah lowered their blood alcohol from 0.8 to 0.5%. And Maryland lowered it for drivers under 21 to 0.2%. And a study by the American Medical Association showed that reduced fatalities by 24%. That's a lot. That's a lot. And even reduce overall drunk driving arrests because of the deterrent that and the fear it installed in drivers that they might otherwise have had a few drinks to abstain before they go out driving for fear that they'd be caught. So let's delve in some other ways that speed limits can help. Okay, numerous studies over the last 40 years have shown what we all know to be true, which is the higher speed limits lead to higher numbers of crashes and deaths. Okay, and lower speed limits lead to reduced crashes and deaths. In 1974, we all remember to conserve fuel. Congress passed a national speed limit of 55 miles an hour. It repealed it 21 years later in 1995, okay? And in 1996, the first year following the repeal, there were 9,100 more highway crash fatalities than the year before, okay? Another study showed there were 33,000 additional deaths between 95 and 2031, attributed solely to an increase in speed limits. And there was a study in South Korea that went the other way. They reduced speed limits in large areas from 100 kilometers an hour to 80, and that resulted in 14% fewer crashes. And a 2016 study showed that for every 5 miles an hour increase in speed limits, there's an 8% increase in fatal accidents, okay? So in this podcast, we've discussed a number of ways in which government actions and policies can literally and directly save lives. And there are vast other arenas, okay, where this is also true, and where government policies, laws, and actions can save lives. I'll just name a couple of them here, okay? We can fund medical research to find cures for incurable diseases, like, as you mentioned, pancreatic cancer, okay? We can fund the CDC to prepare for the next inevitable pandemic. We can fund measures to reduce air pollution, because air pollution contributes to all kinds of diseases and cancer and health conditions, and it shortens lives. We can fund anti-smoking and anti-drug campaigns, including television campaigns, because they've been proven to save lives. We can fund better access to healthcare, especially preventive medicine by all Americans, infants and elderly, because it saves lives. We can take steps to prevent and reduce accidental poisonings, which surprisingly kill 100,000 Americans a year. We can take steps to reduce falls that kill amazingly 45,000. We can provide pads and walkers and stakes and all kinds of stuff that may reduce falls. We can reduce homicides. There's a number of ways that we can reduce homicides. We can work with gangs. We can have these red flag laws. We can do some of the other things we talked about, reduce access to guns. And all these things will reduce homicides. And and we can have these programs outreach to kids. Bill Cosby years ago used to do these commercials to address to the parents of kids and saying to them, look, what do you mean you didn't know your son had a pistol? Okay, and he went out. How did you not know that? How did you allow that to happen? And when you knew it, why didn't you do something about it? Those kinds of things are very effective and can reduce homicides. And then there's suicide. So the 50,000 people a year commit suicide. If we had ads all over the place advertising hotlines for counseling and provided counseling and outreach for that would save a lot of lives. They're all over the Golden Gate Bridge, and there's even a suicide barrier because people go there to jump and they intercept them and they save their lives. So there's a multitude of ways in which the government can intervene in each of these arenas that could save lives. And we're never going to reduce it to zero. But that doesn't mean we can't make a big difference and pass laws and enact policies and programs that reduce these deaths by a significant number every year. And none of these results are a surprise to any of us. These are exactly the outcomes that we would have expected, right? There's no surprises here, okay? So now we come to the punchline of this podcast. Assuming that we are pro-life, what that implies is that we're obligated to do whatever we can within reason to lobby for and vote for those reasonable government measures that clearly save lives. And if being pro-life means anything, it means at least that, doesn't it? And to be truly life cannot mean really anything else other than that. So if you're against abortion on the grounds that it saves lives, then if you're logical, you should be in favor of and support all other reasonable measures that saves lives, okay? And aside from the narrow issue of abortion, wherever you stand on this issue, whether you're for or against it, okay, are we not, all of us, every single one of us, pro-life? Aren't we all pro-life? And if we're pro-life in that broadest and grandest sense of that term, are we not all of us, logically and morally obligated to do everything we can to support all measures that save the lives of our fellow human beings? Now, don't forget to take these insights with you when you head for the polls in this coming election next month, right? Thank you for watching. I look forward to other podcasts with you in the future.
Well, Robert, that was a tremendous opportunity for us to think. I think anybody, if there's a kitten playing in the middle of a busy street, everybody measures the risk that will take to go save that kitten. That's just sort of inherent in people. You don't want to see that kitten get killed or hurt. If you see somebody, friend or family, hurting, like we know friends that are down south in Asheville and the southern states due to the recent hurricanes, you sit there and wonder what we can do to help them, in their suffering. The scenario of this whole life issue is one that is a triangulated foundational theory that people say when you're in counseling, you and your spouse go into counseling, counselors will tell you that if you have one of the issues is over spirituality, it's a very hard thing to untangle because you're dealing with a ghost, whatever that ghost is, whatever that godly ghost is, or their feelings of what their beliefs are, because beliefs are very strong. So that triangulation of that principled higher power is the thing that messes up that family counseling, that causes husbands and wives to get back centered, because that whole nugget over there can be it's a ball of it's a ball of nothingness. It's ghost. It's hard for the therapist to untangle and define. And that's where I believe that we sit with the issues of pro-life, is that these are choices. Ricky Gervais, they were having a talk with one of the talk show hosts, and he says, everybody's all over me because I'm an atheist. And he says, I just don't understand that. And he asked the talk show host, he said, there's 3,000 gods out there. And this talk show host was Roman Catholic. And he asked, Ricky Gervais asked the host, do you believe in those 2,999 other gods? And the talk show host said, well, no, I'm Roman Catholic. So Ricky Gervais basically said, so there's only one that I'm, as out of that 3,000 that I don't believe in, but I agree with you on the other 2,999. So we're only talking a very small portion, very small amount of gods that we can't see or deal with, that I don't believe in, that you're all upset that I'm an atheist and you're not, and blah, 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 blah. Well, what about the other 29,000? And the point I'm trying to make is that I'm very, as you well know, very deep-seated faith in my religion. I mean, it's an everyday thing for me. But what you brought out in this podcast is that people have a choice going to the polls of what their fundamental beliefs are in terms of, what you pointed out, if you could live in Massachusetts or Mississippi based upon your statistics, and you're coming to America and you have a choice, I think Massachusetts looks pretty good through the lens that you painted. I think it's an ideal way to really paint that picture and to point out that in the upcoming election, to understand some of I have granddaughters that I care about them being female. Does somebody have the right to enact laws that is the garden they guard my reproductive rights of my granddaughters? And not only that, the ability to get health care in certain states if they have an emergency. Or if they start spotting, or if they, are we going to have period police? All these questions that are there are very, very powerful, and they're meaningful because they actually do exist, as pointed out in some of these states. I'm sorry?
You touched on the reasons why exactly that I framed up this podcast the way I did, okay? Because I'm not taking on the abortion question, I'm not taking on which of those 3,000 gods. I avoid that, because that's going nowhere.
Right.
And what I concentrated on are these simple, empirical, scientific, indisputable, paths and government policies that you can look at, and you can look at the impact that they have in vital statistics maintained by every county in the United States. And you can see, does this work? Is it saving lives? And how many? And you can decide whether to support that policy or other policies. And many of them are inexpensive. They don't impinge on other people's rights. They're easy to do, and they work. And so my point is that if you are pro-life, that you have an obligation to investigate these things, to take responsibility for what's passed in the legislature, and get in there and support those reasonable, relatively inexpensive provisions, and maybe some of the expensive ones that really work, like providing health care, that will save lives, because that's what the whole being pro-life is about. So I've given these options. I've taken this away from the metaphysical, sterile realm of whether a fetus is a human being or not, and put it into some practical, indisputable question of whether this policy saves lives, and it clearly does, and therefore we should support it. And that's what this is about.
Well, Robert, you said it so clearly and repeated it here, and I hope people take it to heart that basically you're doing a study of one to the other, that if you believe that we should be there to help that little kitty in the middle of the street, then that kitty should move to Massachusetts, or we should enact that laws to save that kitty in other states, and at least have everybody have
if you're a citizen of Mississippi, okay, then you can't sit by and let that kid play in the street, okay? You can't sit by and say, I'm not going to enact these gun restrictions and these other things, driving regulations and a host of other things. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to oppose them because I'm in Mississippi. I mean, and still escape the moral culpability of the deaths that will inevitably come from that, which could have been saved by enacting that. And it's not really, you don't have to move to Massachusetts. You can stay in Mississippi and do what you have to do in Mississippi and vote for those things and make Mississippi more like Massachusetts, and reduce that, which is well within the hands and decision making of people in Mississippi, as it is in all states in the United States. This Mississippi, Massachusetts, it's nationwide, okay?
Right.
And the states are arrayed on this on both sides, and every resident in the United States has options in their state for enactments of public policies and programs that will save lives. And my point here is you're obligated to get in there and support them.
All right. Well, Robert, well said. And as we believe, as we've often said, why people believe things that just ain't so, we don't know. So we look forward to the next time that you come on and sharing your wits and wisdom. And but for right now, thank you very much for all the research. Thank you very much for sharing from your heart. And everybody, give great thoughts to what you heard today. This is old Uncle Randy and saying so long, have a great evening, and do the best you possibly can to love that little kitty in the middle of the traffic, if you know what I mean.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Randy. Thanks for showing up.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Night.